Hi, welcome to Rotary Vise Techniques Part 4. I'm Raj Kletke, and today we'll be concentrating on using the rotary vise to tie in fly bodies. The fly body includes both the abdomen and the thorax. Being able to rotate your fly and hold it in varying positions for ease of tying and examining the fly is probably the most common and important use of a rotary vise. However, today we're going to concentrate on tying in fly bodies. In this case, I already have the chenille in place, and in the classical method, you would move your thread forward to the tie-off point, put in a half hitch, and then use the bobbin cradle to keep the thread out of the way while you direct the materials into their proper location while using your vise in the forward rotation. Once you get to the tie-off point, the bobbin cradle is moved out of the way. The material is tied off in the usual fashion, and then the excess material can be cut off above the hook shank so as not to cut the thread. Using the bobbin cradle slows down fly tying, so I more commonly use the together or parallel method where I take the body material and thread together, occasionally using my rotary vise to get the starting point so they exactly correspond, and then holding the thread and body material together, use the rotary vise function with my left hand while I direct with my right hand the body material and thread. Then when I get to the tie-off point, they are together, and I simply tie off in the usual fashion. Again, once I have it tied off, I would cut the excess body material above the hook shank. Let's practice and review these early rotary vise techniques by tying a woolly bugger. A woolly bugger is an excellent trout fly and an excellent fly to tie on a rotary vise. You'll notice that I've tied in a hair tail. I like a hair tail as it helps prevent the marabou from wrapping around the bend in the hook. However, most fly tiers omit this step, and it is purely optional. At this point, you would tie in your marabou. Many tiers will wet the marabou to keep it under better control. I'm leaving it dry as I believe it shows up better on a video. I measure it for length and then pre-cut for the proper length before tying it to the hook shank. If I want a thick body, I leave lots of fibers on, as I did in this case. If I want a thinner body, I might strip or cut off more of those marabou fibers. I then take my thread back to the normal tail tie-in point and tie in my chenille at this point. After tying in the chenille, I then tie in the hackle by the tip. I am using a wider hackle here than I would normally use, but I believe it shows up better on the video. I like tying my chenille in first, followed by the hackle, as I like making one wrap of the chenille around the hook shank behind the hackle. I think it gives a neater fly, but many tiers will tie the hackle in first and then the chenille. Once I've made that initial wrap by the chenille and have the hackle out of the way, I will use the rotary vise with forward rotation to wind the chenille and thread together in the together or parallel method to the tie-off point, which in a woolly bugger is near the eye of the hook. Pinching to hold the chenille in place allows me to tie it off easily. I then cut off the chenille above the hook shank. I will then use the classical rotary vise technique of controlling the thread with a half hitch at the next tie-off point and bringing the bobbin cradle forward to hold the thread, while I again use the rotary vise in the forward rotation to palmer my hackle forward to the eye or near the eye of the hook. Near the eye of the hook, I like making several rotations, as I do like a little bit thicker hackle at the front of the woolly bugger. At this point, I pinch my hackle to hold it in place while I move my bobbin cradle out of the way, and then tie off the hackle in the usual fashion, again clipping the excess hackle above the hook shank. Using my right and particularly my left hand, I sweep the hackle fibers back to give me exposure to tie a nice, neat head. Once I have my head tied, I need to tie off the thread. You can do this with multiple half hitches. However, I prefer to use a whip finish. I commonly use the whip finish tool, and most commonly on my first whip finish use only 3 wraps, because this allows me to easily pull my thread tight, which gives me complete control over the fly. I don't like using head cement, so I then usually add a second whip finish before clipping the thread and straightening any fibers that are out of place. This is the completed woolly bugger. I more commonly am tying smaller flies. This is a size 14 and I have pheasant tail fibers as body material. Using the rotary vise, I again move the tie-in point of the body materials and the thread so they're at the same starting point, and then using the same parallel technique we saw with the chenille, simply use the rotary vise to wrap these body fibers into place. Once I get to where I want these body fibers to end, I use the same tie-off using my index finger for tension as I wrap the thread around, tying the materials off. Another method I commonly use is called the chenille method. Again, you use your rotary vise to get the starting point of the thread and your body materials together, but rather than wrapping in a parallel fashion, you twist the body materials and thread together. Then wrap using the rotary vise. This chenille method reinforces the body materials but does give a slightly different appearance to the body. When you get to the tie-off point, you tie off exactly as before. Many body materials other than pheasant tail fibers can be used. Some take minor modification. Others are straightforward. Here I've tied in some peacock herl, which I'll be going over the methods that I use most commonly. The most common is simply the together method or parallel method. I just hold the materials as I wrap them around the hook shank. The second most common use is the chenille method, where you twist the body materials around the thread before wrapping onto the hook shank. The chenille method does reinforce the body materials slightly better, but there are subtle differences. Try both, see what you like best. It may vary from one material to another. Please feel free to experiment and use what works best for you. While not an issue with the parallel method, having the thread free at the tie-off point can be an issue with the chenille method. Therefore, I wrap the materials around the thread only a few times if I'm going to be wrapping the hook shank only a few times. This allows the thread to be free at the time of the tie-off, and I can tie off in the usual fashion. Controlling dubbing on your thread is also a nice technique with the rotary vise. When you're putting on fine dubbing, controlling its thickness really isn't an issue, but when putting on coarse dubbing, it can sometimes cause problems. If you put on the dubbing, rotating it clockwise, it will tend to stay slightly tighter when doing a normal wrap. But I can easily control the thickness of my dubbing simply by putting it on, getting it started over the hook. Now I can tighten it as much as I want to a nice thin thread, or leave it wider, depending on the effect I want on the fly body. Again, just twist it very tight. I can almost make it as thin as a string and get a very, very tight body. So that's another place where the rotary vise technique has been very valuable to me. When we get to the end and I want to tie it off, if I have extra dubbing, I simply remove the dubbing in the usual fashion. I like using biots on some of my fly bodies. A biot is actually a barb from the leading edge of a primary feather. The orientation of biots can cause problems for people. Unfortunately, we're not going to cover that here. I mainly want to cover a third way of handling the thread when using your rotary vise. This biot is from a left primary feather, so it allows me the simplest orientation. The ridge on the biot is actually facing away from me towards the hook, and the thick part of the biot is on the top with the thin part of the biot on the bottom. This allows me to simply fold the biot forward, which now puts the ridge facing me, and then move it into a perpendicular fashion so it's now standing vertical. At this point, I could wrap it forward together with the thread as we've shown before, but I want to show you a third way of handling the thread, and that's to use my middle finger essentially as a replacement for the bobbin cradle. This allows me to hold the thread with my middle finger, wrap slowly forward, making sure that I am overlapping the biot slightly. The posterior, or the edge of the biot towards the bend of the hook, is the prominent edge and leaves a nice little ridge, as you can see, giving a segmented body appearance. When I reach my tie-in point near the eye of the hook, my thread is already there, and I can tie off in the usual fashion using my finger and thumb to pinch the material into place. Once I have it ready to cut off, I want to be sure not to cut the material below the hook, as I could accidentally cut my thread. So again, I use my rotary vise to simply move the material I want to cut off to the top of the thread. Now I can tie it off the rest of the way, and I would be able to continue on with the rest of the fly. In this close-up, you can see the biot ribbing quite well. In the next video, Rotary Vise Techniques Part 5, we'll be adding conventional ribbing and putting the techniques together to tie the flashback pheasant tail nymph. See you soon.